Hi, welcome to Videos from the Ville. This is Professor Charles Greenewalt, and this is Introduction to City Planning. On this particular segment, we want to take a look at economic studies that are performed within the realm of city planning. So let's take a look at economic studies. We find that in economic studies, there are different methods of urban analysis that are fairly good at telling us what the economy of an urban area is composed of. In other words, they identify the economic skeleton. And I remind you to please follow along with this presentation with your PowerPoints. PowerPoints will help you navigate and negotiate through this lecture with me. We find that methods of urban economic analysis are not very good at telling us how the urban economy operates. So methods of urban economic analysis are good at telling us what the skeleton of an urban economy is, but not very good at telling us how the urban economy operates. In other words, how do the bones of the skeleton work together? We find that there were many informal economic development programs that were conducted in our cities for years. In the late 1960s, as the suburbs grew and as the cities were losing more and more industry at an alarming rate, we find that city planning departments only at that point in the late 60s became heavily involved with this problem and with this type of planning. If a planning department doesn't handle economic studies and economic development, then it's probably going to be handled by a Department of Community Development, where planning is organized as a bureau. What is the purpose of urban economic studies? Richard Andrews is one of our experts on urban economies, and Richard Andrews explained that the purpose of urban economic studies can be investigated in 6 interrelated questions. The 6 interrelated questions are: why does the community exist? What factors explain the continuing development or the lack of development of the community? So why does the community exist is number 1. The purpose, again, these questions will help us understand the purpose of economic studies, urban economic studies. Why does the community exist? Number 1. Number 2, what are the principal causes of change in the economy? Number 3, what are the most important forms of imbalance in the community economy? It's that. So number 1, why does the community exist? What are the principal causes of change in the economy? What are the most important forms of imbalance in the community economy? Number 4, how can the balances of the economy be remedied? Number 5, how can economic problem remedies be expressed as community development targets? And lastly, number 6, how does the community's economic structure, problems, problem remedies, and targets relate to other priorities of the community, and how does it relate to other communities in the region? So again, the last question is: how does the community's economic structure, their problems, the remedies to those problems, and the targets to solve those problems relate to other priorities of the community? How does it relate to other communities in the region? Well, one of the things that we take a look at in economic studies for the city is always the development of what we call base theory. The beginning of regional economics can be traced back to the writings of Alfred Weber. Alfred Weber. Sorry, I'm having some problems. I just came in from outside in the storm. And I'm having some problems with my eyes here. Apologize. Um, Beginnings of regional economics can be dated back to the early 1900s in the writings of Alfred Weber. This is the foundation of base theory. The foundation of base theory is that the structure of the economy is made up of two broad classes of productive effort. The structure of an economy is made up of two broad classes of productive effort. One would be export market activities, and the second would be local market activities. Export market activities are basic activities which produce and which distribute goods and services for export to firms and to individuals outside a defined localized economic area. So export market activities, again, these are basic activities that produce and distribute goods and services to export to firms and to individuals outside of your defined local economic area. So those are export market activities. And then we have local market activities, and these are the non-basic activities where goods and services are consumed at home within the boundaries of the local economic area. And that is local market activities. The distinction between these two kinds of economic activity is important because it implies that the reason for the existence and the growth of a particular region is its capacity to produce goods and services that can be exported beyond the local borders. If the region's export market activities grow, the local market activities will also grow. They will also respond. If export market activities shrink, if they contract, so will local market activities contract. The relationship between the two is absolutely strong. So, what are the preparatory steps that we have to take for a comprehensive economic-based study? If we want to do a comprehensive economic-based study, we find that this is a very rigorous research undertaking, and the major steps that need to be taken prior to such a study include, number one, we have to identify the study area boundaries. Number two, we have to develop a detailed work program. Number three, we need to develop an overall research framework, and the overall research framework would include individual staff assignments and the task completion schedules. So, the major steps to prepare for a comprehensive economic-based study is number one, identification of study area boundaries. Number two, developing a detailed work program. Number three, developing an overall research framework where each individual staff member would have assignments and task completion schedules. You find the next step would be identification of specific data needs. What information are we going to need? And what would be the potential source for that data, those data needs? Identification of specific data needs, potential sources, and this data would be both published and unpublished. Next, we would have a selection of agencies, individuals, and representatives of selected economic enterprises that all need to be interviewed. A selection of agencies, individuals, and representatives. A selection of agencies, individuals, and representatives of selected economic enterprises to be interviewed. Next, we have a formulation of pertinent survey forms, pertinent survey forms and questionnaires that you might want to use. So, Andrews goes ahead and he lays out the steps of his economic-based technique, and that's all laid out in the PowerPoints for you. The steps of Andrews' economic-based technique is one, area delineation, deciding the boundaries of the area you're studying. Area delineation, number one. Number two is economic functional classifications. Economic functional classification. We find that this is simply taking the total urban economy and dividing it into the structural parts that are commonly used by economists and by the Bureau of the Census. This is formalized in a standard industrial classification system, and this standard industrial classification system appears in the Standard Industrial Classification Manual. The Standard Industrial Classification Manual. It's published by the Office of Management and Budget. We have different categories for different digits, and industries are broken down to a 4-digit level. More specialized categories have more digits. We find that it may be one certain type of an industry, that's the first digit, and then a more specialized form of that industry would be the second digit, and so on and so forth. Each 4 digits indicate increasing specificity to tell us exactly what that business might be. Find that most economic-based studies only use a 2-digit level, but if one can get to 3 digits or 4 digits, the results are going to be better. Number 3 is base identification. We need to distinguish between export and local market activities. Okay? So, for Andrews' economic-based technique, we have first area delineation, determining which area we're studying, economic functional classification, base identification, distinguishing between the export and the local market activities. Number 4, we have to select a unit of measure for economic activities in the area. We have to select a unit of measure for economic activities in the area. The 2 most common units of measure, and one which have the most accessible data, are sales and employment. Sales and employment. We have to select a unit of measure for economic activities in the area. And the 2 most common units of measure, and one which have the most accessible data, are sales and employment. Next, we have to calculate the ratios between parts of an urban economy and the parts of the community population. It's a significant assumption of the economic-based method is that these ratios are constant or they're relatively constant over time. Calculating a ratio between the parts of the urban economy and the community population. A problem in this 5th step is to make sure that the ratio that you discover are the normal ratios for that areas. And this can be seen through trend analysis, looking at your results over time. Finally, number 6 is the projections of the economic data. By using the ratios that we discover in these steps, you can see how changes in a region's economy will affect employment and will affect population. Changes in a region's economy will affect employment, either for good or for bad, and population. Now, what are the limitations of Andrews' economic-based technique? The limitations of Andrews' economic-based technique is that the results are often crude and often inaccurate. Number 2, the second limitation of Andrews' economic-based technique is sometimes it's very difficult to distinguish between export and local market activities. Sometimes it's very difficult to distinguish between export and local market activities. Number 3, another limitation of Andrews' economic-based technique is it ignores the import side of the area's economy. It ignores the import side of the area economy and its effect on the economy. How much is the local economy bringing in, and what effect does that have on the economy? Well, there's other techniques for urban economic analysis. We have, for example, in addition to Andrew's economic base technique, we have input-output urban economic analysis. Input-output. Input-output is used for national economies. What we do is we are identifying the source of purchases and the destination for the sale of goods for all sectors of the economy. The source of purchases and the destination of sales of goods for all sectors of the economy. The advantages are that it takes into account the imports into the region. The advantages, it takes into account the imports into the region. The disadvantages are that the sales data which it needs to function are difficult to obtain for specific areas. Again, the advantages of input-output is it takes into account the imports into an area. It's saying that that's something that we want to do. The disadvantages is the sales data that it needs to function can be difficult to get for specific regions. It's very effective at the national level where aggregate data is available, but sometimes regional data is much more difficult to pin down. This method is costly to use because it requires the service of trained, experienced statisticians and economists that are going to be working for long periods of time, and large amounts of computer time are also necessary. Well, we also have something called the shift-share analysis, or the step-down ratio method. The shift-share analysis. Shift-share analysis rests on the premise that the level of employment, the level of income, and other measures, other economic measures in a small area is functionally related to the level of that activity occurring within a larger area, of which the smaller area is apart. So if we look and we do an analysis of historical data on the economic variables that we want to forecast, ratios can be developed to help express the functional relationship between the smaller economic units and the larger economic unit. And then these ratios can be applied to reliable forecasts for economic variables for the larger geographic unit until, by a step-down process, numerical forecasts of the same variables are obtained for the smaller area. So we're looking at how a larger area is performing over time, and we can predict based on the relationship between the larger and the smaller area in the past, what effect that will have on the smaller area in the future. The primary advantages of shift-share analysis is that the general availability of the data that's used, it's a straightforward methodology, and it generally obtains reasonable results at reasonable costs. And in fact, it is the most commonly used economic method. It is the most commonly used method. So again, the primary advantages are the general availability of the data, the straightforward methodology, and the reasonable results and costs. What are deficiencies in economic base analysis? Deficiencies in economic base analysis, many have been more concerned with the refinement of numbers rather than with the integrity of premises. So we find that some of these studies, the analysts who have done them, are far more concerned with trying to refine the numbers than to look at the big assumptions that they made that the study is based on. For example, are the local market activities related to the export market activities in this region or not? The second deficiency in economic base analysis is that planners have not mastered, planners have not devoted enough effort into supplying the information which is yielded into effective policy decisions to encourage economic growth in areas. Again, planners have not mastered, have not devoted enough effort into applying this information that they acquired and using it for policy making, effective policy decisions to encourage further economic growth in one region or another. Thirdly, another deficiency of the economic base analysis is there's been a problem in dealing with economic subsystems of larger regions. Analysis is usually done better and more data is available for the study of large areas than for smaller geographic units. And the smaller geographic units are frequently the policy-making governmental areas. The failure to understand the importance of these, for example, invisible city lines, and to think in terms of the city economy rather than the metropolitan economy. We're saying here it's easier to analyze a metropolitan economy, but frequently we want information only about the city economy. And sometimes it's very difficult to chisel out of the metropolitan area exactly just what applies for the city and what doesn't apply for the city. So that can be challenging. Well, we find that for a long, long time we have projected that many urban areas have been suffering an economic malaise, that word that Jimmy Carter made so famous in the 1970s. You find that this urban economic malaise really could be seen beginning perhaps in the 70s, and then it disappeared, would come back and disappear, go back and forth several times, but certainly one can say that we are suffering again from an urban economic malaise. Excuse me. Well, what are the problems that we see in an urban economy? One is unemployment, and much of the unemployment is structural unemployment. Another problem that we see in the urban economy is deterioration. Many center city neighborhoods have been deteriorating ever since the 1960s and before. We find a third problem with the urban areas has been underproductivity. Center cities have large reservoirs of unused or underused economic resources. And those large reservoirs of unused or underused economic resources would include land, large tracts of land that are deserted or not used, buildings that have been abandoned or boarded shut, and people with lower skill sets, for example, or people who haven't decided what course they want to take yet. Other problems that show this urban economic malaise that we're concerned about would be disinvestment. Disinvestment, we find that there's only a fraction of the total new private investment that's made each year in the nation's urban regions flows into the central city. We find that much of the private investment made in the nation's urban regions is flowing into the periphery or into the suburbs. So disinvestment has been a problem. We've seen this past summer as unrest has increased in the cities, we find, and as many businesses, for example, have been attacked at one point or another, or looted. There's been many, and of course that combined with the effects of COVID-19, where many of the businesses had to close down and they were struggling to stay open, and then if they were looted or attacked in some cities that had urban unrest, we find that it would make it very difficult for those businesses to ever come back, for those jobs ever to come back. We have decentralization as another problem that we can see in this urban economic malaise. Decentralization, we find that even in the most prosperous metropolitan areas, there's a continued outflow of jobs and of businesses from the central cities out. Another problem of the cities, again, it shows urban economic malaise, is of course the social burdens that these cities have to bear. The cities have become the havens. Cities have become the havens of the poor, the elderly, and the disadvantaged. They carry the heaviest loads of welfare and of social services. Certainly here in our area of South Central Pennsylvania, when you look for where are the missions for the disadvantaged, um, we find that the Salvation Armies, for example, and the Bethesda Mission, for example, in Harrisburg, are all located downtown, for example. And if you are following along in your PowerPoints for this presentation, you'll see some photographs of some of the deterioration within urban areas that affects the economy, and some unemployment lines, which many of you have seen in the news recently. Well, as a result of these trends, as a result of these conditions, central cities have become increasingly dependent on outside resources. They're increasingly dependent upon federal and upon state assistance to maintain their fiscal viability. Well, we find this a persistence, if you will, for central area decline. This persistence of central area decline, we can find that in virtually every metropolitan area, both jobs and investments are growing outside the central city. They're growing outside the central city boundaries, and they're declining inside. The same is true of the number of businesses, establishments, populations, and property values. Property values continue to go down. Population down. The number of businesses down. We can qualify this, and the qualification can be found possibly in some southeastern states and some southwestern states, where areas where annexation can be used by the cities, you don't find the same phenomena, because where annexation is granted to the cities, cities can simply throw out their boundaries further and capture the businesses which have tried to flee the city to recapture that tax revenue, for example. That is not true of most cities in the north and the northeast. They do not have the power of annexation, and they cannot recapture the businesses that have decided to leave. But even in those areas of the southeast and southwest that have the power of annexation, so they can try to expand their boundaries and recapture the businesses which have left, you still see the same forces of inner city economic deterioration at work in the center part of those particular cities. There are some basic forces that make it difficult for the private sector to invest or operate profitably within the city limits. What might they be? There's different forces, basic forces, that make it difficult for the private sector to invest or operate profitably within the city limits. So this persistence of central area decline, we find virtually every metropolitan area. We find that jobs and investment are going outside the central city, and jobs and businesses are declining on the inside of the city. The same is true for property values and population. Oops. You'll find, as I've said a moment ago, also basic forces make it difficult for the private sector. Basic forces make it difficult for the private sector to invest or for the private sector to operate profitably within city limits. We find consumer markets continue to expand in the suburbs, and these new consumers attract investment for the full range of service industries. So consumer markets tend to be growing in the suburbs, and so business is following those dollars into the suburbs. We find other things that contribute to this persistence of central city decline is that many new plants, or many plants that are seeking to perhaps expand or revitalize themselves, they seek more land for expanded and efficient operations. And if they're in the central city, that land isn't there. We find now that when factories are built, rather than having multi-story factories as we found in the 19th and the early part of the 20th century, now factories like to be on one level and expand out, not on multiple levels. So we have an awareness of the costs of horizontal sprawl regarding land use, but there are still vast suburban resources that will be used for continued expansion of these industries who want to be on one level. Because cities are older, they're substantially built, there are much more difficulties in land assembly, which will end up costing any businesses a higher amount for land development. Well, other things that contribute to the persistence of central area decline is because of larger, quicker, and more certain investments can be seen. You can have larger, quicker, and more certain investments and returns on those investments in suburban enterprises. So suburban enterprises will see a larger, quicker, and more certain investment return. There's certainly a paradox at work here that large parts of most central cities are inadequately served by many consumer facilities, despite the presence of large numbers of consumer dollars. There's lots of consumer dollars left in the central city, but in many instances it's very difficult to find a grocery store, for example, in a central city. We find that there are some mitigating factors that have come into the mix, some factors that are trying to tamp down these persistence of central area decline. What has been working to the contrary? We find the first item was heavy post-war migrations. After the Second World War, there were lots of migrations of low-skilled and disadvantaged populations into the central cities that were sharply reduced. So we find that these heavy post-World War II migrations of low-skilled and disadvantaged workers into the central cities, those have been reduced and curtailed. Populations are no longer leaving, for example, the South and moving into the urban areas of the North. We find another mitigating factor in the persistence of central area decline is the rising demand for central city housing on the part of middle and upper income families. That's been true. Now I wonder after this summer if that will continue to be true. We've had a rising demand for central city housing on the part of middle and upper income families. Many of these families are childless. Many of these families have double breadwinner families with large discretionary incomes. Other mitigating factors is that major physical improvements have to be made. Major physical improvements. Um, Major physical improvements that were made in the central city as the result of civic and governmental efforts in recent years have begun to pay off with new employment created by new sports venues or convention centers, for example. So starting in the late 70s through the 80s and 90s, we find that many governments tried to reverse this persistence of central area decline, and they invested in sports venues and in convention centers, and some of those are beginning to pay off. We find there's also the presence of hundreds of neighborhood groups that have been supporting rehabilitation efforts in the city and to support conservation of certain neighborhoods and of certain areas, and that can bring stability to many neighborhoods. I have some slides in my PowerPoints that show you some revitalization of downtown areas of Cincinnati, Ohio in recent years. Other mitigating factors for the persistence of central area decline. Another mitigating factor would be that we have to take a look at energy shortages and the whole question of energy. Whole question of energy shortages, and environmental protection, and the quality of life. These are all generating forces for development that's closer in to the center city, and restrictions on sprawl within the suburbs and the rural areas. There's a new recognition at the national level, and I think this will continue even in light of what has occurred in many of the cities this summer. There's a new recognition at the national level that the problems of the cities must be dealt with more effectively. There's been a recognition at the national level that the problems of the city must be dealt with more effectively for some time. There are many of us, myself included, who had called starting back in the early 90s for a Marshall Plan for the cities of the United States. And I think that still may be in order. Well, you find that another thing that we see is the urgency for local actions. The urgency for local actions. We find that many of the factors that affect economic activity within the city are decisively affected by local public policies. For example, factors that influence investment decisions that must be dealt with locally are what? Factors that influence investment decisions that have to be dealt with locally would be dealing with congestion. Is there congestion in the neighborhood? The obsolescence of buildings. Are the buildings obsolete, or can we continue to use them? Public service delivery. Are fire and police and ambulance services readily available? And that is combined with security, specifically looking at fire and police services. How strong are they, and how good are they? We have to look at the taxes of an area. It's something that the local authorities can affect. And lastly, the availability of capital. How many funds are available? Is there money that's readily available to invest or not? Well, we find that there has been some failures in the past to try to deal with central area decline. We find that starting with the Great Society in the mid-1960s, we've had billions of federal dollars. Billions of federal dollars, such as the Model Cities program, which have been funneled into the cities to improve their economies, and they proved ineffective. These efforts can be grouped, if you will, into three major programs. The three major programs that have not drawn the type of success that we had hoped are slum clearance, primarily of housing, urban renewal, and model cities. So we want to take a look at slum clearance, urban renewal, and model cities. Well, with slum clearance, and then we have some pictures in the PowerPoints as well. Here's slum clearance that had been going on in Liverpool in the United Kingdom. Slum clearance helped to eliminate some of the most seriously deteriorating neighborhoods, particularly in the aftermath of the Second World War, in the aftermath of the Korean War, in the aftermath of the Vietnam War. It replaced poor housing with better housing, but the program had little effect on creating conditions that would generate broad economic development. So we can tear down old housing, but that doesn't mean that we are going to be able to find the conditions that we need for economic success and for economic vitality for that community. Urban renewal projects, here we had a greater focus on economic development, but the greatest successes of the urban renewal projects were really found in the central business districts. And lastly, we had model cities, and with the model cities, the funding was just too thin. It was too widely dispersed to produce any lasting efforts or any leveraging of private investment, private capital because of the investment of the government. What happened with model cities, for example, was this program that was part of the Great Society. Of course, all funding has to be approved by the Congress, and when the Model Cities program went to the Senate for Senate approval, it had to go through the Senate Appropriations Committee, and at that time the chairman of the Senate Appropriations Committee was none other than, who was this? This was, it was a, yes, it was a senator. It was a senator from, I have to look and get back to you. It was from a senator in, I believe, oh yes, it's from a senator in Maine, and the senator in Maine, he had stated that he wasn't going to approve this program and let it go through if, in fact, some of his cities in Maine didn't qualify. The whole notion of the Model Cities program was to spend a lot of money in just a few places and turn them around. What this particular senator from Maine, his insistence, it was a Democratic senator from Maine, and he insisted that if Portland, Maine wouldn't be eligible for funding, then he wasn't going to approve the program. So the criteria was rewritten so that Portland, Maine qualified. Well, when Portland, Maine qualified, then we found that Harrisburg, Pennsylvania qualified, Richmond, Virginia qualified, Lansing, Michigan qualified. So rather than spending a lot of money in just a few cities, this new criteria resulted in this program taking a lot of money and thinly dispersing it all across America, and there was no difference made anywhere. Well, the persistence of central area decline can be seen in two stages of policy. We have two stages of policy change. We find in the early 1970s, both parties in the Congress believed that we had too many categorical grant programs, and that these categorical grant programs took away local initiatives. These categorical grant programs were replaced by the Department of Housing and Urban Development, by the Community Development Block Grant Program, and by Community Services Administration money. Remember, categorical grants are grants for specific things, and we find that the Great Society of Lyndon Johnson, indeed, without consultation with the local authorities and without consultation from the state authorities, they simply put in place a whole series of programs that they thought would be of great service to America without talking to the local and state officials who could have told them what they needed. So therefore, we have all these categorical grants for things that no one necessarily applied for or wanted or needed. We find that, and we find eventually both parties recognize that. Well, when we have economic rebuilding within the city boundaries, since the first stage has been implemented, federal urban policy is also beginning to realize that we need to make the cities work again, not just the metropolitan area. So when we look at economic rebuilding within the city boundaries, we find that we can't just help the metropolitan areas. Again, we need to go within the metropolitan area to the specific city itself. Look where the city boundaries are, and we have to help the city itself and not just the metropolitan area. Well, if we look at, we can do a summary of what urban economic problems are like. And it couldn't be more true today than it was in the late 1970s to mid 1970s. The longer urban economic problems are ignored, the worse they're going to become. The worse that urban economic problems get, the less capacity are available, the less capacity there is in any city to remove the negative factors and create conditions in which the private marketplace might work effectively. Well, what are the adverse factors that make so many portions of cities a no man's land? What are the adverse factors that make so many portions of cities no man's land? We can go down through 9 right now. Number 1, we have corridors of vacant commercial space. Drive through the city of Baltimore sometime. You can go down blocks and all the buildings have been boarded up and abandoned. In Baltimore, just blocks away from Johns Hopkins Hospital, which is the finest hospital supposedly in all of America. We have, secondly, random, inefficient neighborhood commercial districts. We'll have some neighborhood commercial districts, and as we said, some of them were built haphazardly, and they are not very efficient in terms of leveraging economic activity in the area. Number 3, we have large areas of unused or underutilized industrial land. Number 4, we have unoccupied loft type factories and warehouses. We have so many abandoned warehouses and so many abandoned or unoccupied loft type factories. We can find them in South Philadelphia. I've been in many of them in South Philadelphia and can't believe that we can't find a purpose for them. Number 5, we find that other adverse factors that make so many portions of cities a no man's land are inadequately maintained housing that's not properly maintained. Number 6 is decaying docks, decaying piers for the shipping industry. Number 7 is untrained manpower. We have a real problem in America where everyone thinks and believes they have to go to college. Going to college is wonderful. It will be well worth your while. You'll become a more complete individual. It doesn't necessarily promise you, however, a job or skills that are necessary for lifelong employment. We have to remember that there are a whole host of employment opportunities in America in the trades. And sometimes with the educational background that you might get in college and then additional trade training, you will be unstoppable. You find that America still needs world-class plumbers, world-class carpenters, world-class heating and air conditioning people. And so we have, for 2 generations, made fun of vocational technical training and vocational technical education. Well, in fact, we need to emphasize that we need world-class machinists, and we need them now. We need welders, and we need them now. And there are lots of jobs that are available to them. So we have untrained manpower. We have, number 8, abandoned property. And number 9, we have the public, the cities, acquiring, in many instances, lots of tax delinquent properties. And those properties, once they're tax delinquent and in the hands of the public sector, they're not going to be producing any more tax revenue for the city in the near term. What are the objectives of local public action when it comes time to economic vitality and economic action? The objectives of local public action is, number 1, we want to remove any government impediments to investment. Remove government impediments to investment. Number 2, we want to assist in providing and improving land and services. We want to assist to provide land and services. And also we want to try to make sure that there's public financial aid or incentives that are available to make economic projects, to make projects economically feasible, to make them economically competitive. Number 4, the 4th objective of local public action is to make improvements in an area's reputation, in their general climate and their receptivity to business. These are all things that I had to do and got to do in Greene County, Virginia, as Director of Community Development. Well, what are the basic strategies for economic development planning? In mature cities, cities that have been with us for many decades, we find that frequently they will choose to retain existing industry. So mature cities, one economic development strategy is to keep the industry you have and then combine that with retail, convention, and hotel projects for downtown and neighborhood commercial development. Try to keep the existing industry that you have and then try to have projects in the downtown area that would involve retail, convention, and hotels. The objective there is to retain the income tax base, keep the income tax base within the city, and provide entry-level jobs to the private sector for the critically unemployed group, which is traditionally minority youth in recent last 2 generations. I have some photographs in your PowerPoints of the Lancaster Convention Center and the Marriott in Penn Square, and what a good job the folks in Lancaster City and Lancaster County did in converting the Wat & Shan store in Lancaster City into an area that continues to provide economic vitality for the city of Lancaster. Basic strategies of economic development planning. Basic strategies of economic development planning would be to promote or to attract new industry from outside the city. Now, this tactic could hurt other cities, and you have to be aware of that. Another basic strategy of economic development planning is to foster entrepreneurship. And fostering entrepreneurship can be done by junior achievement, for example. In addition to junior achievement, it can be done by the Small Business Administration. The Small Business Administration, part of the U.S. Department of Commerce. And it has been done by the Community Services Administration, working with private business and working with local government. Economic development concepts that I want you to be aware of as we utilize this material and we look at the economy of cities. We talked some time ago about leverage, using public funds to encourage private investment, greater private investment of an equal amount or of a greater amount. So we want to use public monies when we can to try to incentivize or to bring in private monies that would not ordinarily be available. The use of the public funds could be, for example, to reduce the risk for many of the private investors. We also have linkage. Linkage is another economic development concept for the cities that's important. This can also be called intergovernmental or interagency coordination and cooperation. All that linkage is coordinating the activities of different federal, state, and local government agencies so that we achieve a common goal. For example, when an industry wanted to come to Virginia in the late 1970s and early 1980s, they went to the Division of Industrial Development and the Division of Industrial Development of the Department of Commerce had information on every county in Virginia, all the land that was available, the resources that were available, and they could put together a package for you. They could put together a site for you, and then they could show you where and how you could get the financing and who you should work with to get the financing for whatever project you had in mind. Packaging, well, that's just what I was talking about. Packaging is piecing together the financing and all the approvals that are needed to get a project started. You can, when you are truly involved with packaging, you can arrange to sort of smooth out the zoning approvals, private loans, public loans, perk tests for the land, and public capital improvements that needed to be made to pave the way for this new economic activity. We can have enterprise zones, another economic development concept. Enterprise zones are areas where businesses can locate and then not pay any taxes, say for 5 years or for 10 years or so. And by not paying any taxes for 10 years, it makes it very attractive for many businesses to locate there and a chance for them to make a greater profit. We also have targeting. We find that sufficient resources have to be committed to one problem in one place to attain a critical mass. It's not wise, for example, for a city to make sewer and street access improvements on 20 separate industrial locations around the city. Perhaps it should be on 1 or 2 sites. So we need to target certain areas. We need to bring our resources to bear to make 1 or 2 areas likely areas for investment instead of having a small number of resources everywhere and not making a difference. This is what we talked about when we were talking about the Model Cities program, isn't it? Well, we find Richard Starr has written extensively about economic development, and what has he told us about the process of economic development? He has set out a summary on the process of economic development that we'd like to take a look at and walk through so you're familiar with how you go about spurring economic development in a city. 1, you have to identify who's involved in your community. Of course, the mayor, the city council, and perhaps local community leaders. So, number 1, identify who's involved in your community when it comes to economic development. Number 2, you have to assess the economic development climate. What's the economic development climate? What is the taxation like? What are development regulations like? What are the trends in the economy? So you have to sort of get a handle on what the economic development climate is like in your area. Number three, you have to identify the barriers, the problems, the constraints, whether those constraints are physical conditions, locational constraints, or community values. Um, Examples of this could be that there's no airport in your area, there's no navigable rivers, there is no major highway, or perhaps you find that there is conflicts of interest between the proposed project and the residents of an area. One of the things that was happening when I was in Greene County was that Coors Beer from, of course, Colorado wanted to have a manufacturing facility, a production facility in the east as well as in the Rocky Mountains. And they came to the Blue Ridge and they found Rockingham County they thought was perfect. And they decided that they'd build a large factory there and they would brew Coors beer in the east as well as the west, and that eventually happened. But what they didn't realize that Rockingham County, Virginia, was one of the homes, one of the largest homes to the Mennonite faith on the East Coast of the United States. And so they had to sit down with the Mennonite community and they had to take their concerns into consideration. And they worked together and they found ways to bring the economic vitality to Rockingham County, but still respect the culture and the lifestyles of the Mennonite residents. Other things we have to do is identify strong points. Do we have rail lines? Do we have readily available water supplies? We have to also identify alternative program possibilities. If our program can't go through, what might be another program possibility? Would it be a downtown project? Would it be a new industrial park? Could we help existing firms expand? But we need to cast our net out a little further than just one project. Excuse me. Well, we have to set priorities. Among these program possibilities, we have to evaluate their feasibility and we have to select first project. We have to set priorities among the program possibilities, we evaluate the feasibility, and we select the first project. We did this in Greene County when I had a English company wanting to locate there that would produce valves. I had a company from New York State wanted to locate in Greene County to build um, circuit boards for computers. We had another company from Pittsburgh that wanted to build hearing aids with us. We were happy to have them all, and we wanted to help them all, but we had to pick uh, the uh, the project that we were going to emphasize and work with first. And we picked the English project, the folks from England who wanted to build the valve company, because there was the promise of more jobs from that program than any others. Oh, we also had a New York company that was going to build another factory that would be involved with textile processing. And we dealt with them all, but who are we going to deal with first? We decided to deal with the valve company first. Um, Sometimes it's good to perform a demonstration project. And the demonstration project can identify federal funds, state funds, and you want to perform that demonstration project from beginning to end. We want to keep the process ongoing. We want to identify new economic issues as they come up. We want to identify new prospects as they emerge. We want to tackle new projects as resources are available and the time is available for that. And this would be the process that we would use for economic development. If we can do those things, we'll be well on our way. Economic development can be a very frustrating subject, but it's will probably be your one of your number one or two priority in city planning. Without a strong economy, there are no jobs for your residents, and without jobs for your residents, your city will slowly um, wither away. So we have to be very concerned about economic vitality, and we have to do everything we can to promote it. Okay, I think we're done with um, economic studies, and we're going to wrap this up and go on to the next subject.